The clip showed fire. What they did not show was the moment the war changed shape. That happened when Iran stopped controlling the sky over the route to its own capital. When broad strike waves are already reaching western Tehran, you are not watching the start of a war. You are watching what comes after the shield has already been punctured and the capital has started living under repeat access from the air. That is why the line that should hit you hardest is not 13,000 targets. It is the claim that within 24 hours, the way to Tehran had already been paved, because once that happens, every bunker, launcher, command node, and fuel artery inside Iran starts living on borrowed time. Roughly 200 Iranian air defense systems were reportedly hit in the opening phase, and effective control of the airspace from western Iran to central Tehran was established within 24 hours. That is not a war update. That is the sound of a state losing the one layer that keeps the rest of the state from being hunted in sequence. If you want the version of this war that hits harder than the headlines, stay here, subscribe now, and drop one word in the comments, exposed or exaggerated, because that single choice tells you how you think this war ends. 13,000 targets is the number meant to overwhelm you. 80% of Iran's air defense is gone is the number meant to terrify Iran. Put them together and the message is simple. This is not just destruction anymore. This is controlled entry into the country's strategic core. Once you understand that, the title gets darker. A giant bomb count tells you scale. A broken air defense bell tells you direction. Scale alone is noise. Direction tells you what they are trying to do next. The opening blow was built as a machine, not a gesture. Around 200 fighter aircraft were committed in the first wave, which means this campaign was designed from the first minute to tear apart a network, not to send a message and go home. That distinction matters. A punishment raid hurts the enemy and leaves tomorrow uncertain. A system kill attacks the parts that make tomorrow possible for the enemy at all. Could operate at greater distances and did not require tight formation flying. The F-35 was able to guide and direct other aircraft across the battle space. The F-35 IDR was guiding and directing other aircraft across the battle space, which means stealth was not just striking targets itself. It was opening corridors and dragging the rest of the strike force deeper behind it. And that is how you stop merely surviving enemy airspace and start managing it. And once you start managing enemy airspace, the war becomes cheaper for you and more humiliating for them. Radar is no longer reassurance. Launchers are no longer a barrier. Geography stops protecting what the state thought. Distance, that is the real meaning of the 80% claim. Not just burning air defense sites, not just destroyed systems. It means the cost of reaching into Iran's interior drops. While the cost of defending that interior rises every day, the pressure continues. Then came the public count, designed to crush doubt. More than 15,000 enemy targets had been struck at a pace of over 1,000 a day, which is the kind of number meant to tell audiences at home that the war machine is not just operating, it is devouring. That number lands because it sounds final. It sounds like whatever Iran built across years is being erased at a speed no state can absorb. It sounds like the war has already tipped from attrition into dismantling. But then another number was used. About 13,000 targets already bombed, with roughly 3,000 still left. Once the same war is being sold with different giant totals, the count stops sounding like pure accounting and starts sounding like psychological warfare aimed at everyone listening. That does not make the campaign small. It makes the number itself strategic. The point is not just to describe damage. The point is to create the feeling that resistance has become mathematically stupid, and that is exactly where people get trapped. They hear a giant number and assume the war must be almost finished. But modern air war does not become decisive because the ledger is huge. It becomes decisive when the systems that slow tomorrow's strikes are dying faster than the state can replace them. That is why the title only works if you read both halves together. 13,000 targets without the air defense collapse is just scale. 80% of the air defense is gone without the target count is just vulnerability. Put them together and the real threat emerges. Scale plus access. And here is the part that blows a hole through the victory pose. U.S. intelligence could determine with certainty that only about 1/3 of Iran's missile arsenal had actually been destroyed, which means public triumph was running far ahead of what the intelligence community was prepared to certify. That single fact makes the war much more dangerous than the headline version. It suggests the coalition may have opened Iran faster than it has emptied Iran. The shield can be collapsing while the surviving arsenal is still dangerous enough to keep the war alive. This is where the title becomes real intelligence instead of propaganda. If the sky story is broadly true and the missile story is only partly true, then both sides are trapped inside a brutal middle. One side can reach deeper than before. The other side still has enough left to punish everybody for believing it is finished. Tehran later admitted some air defenses were damaged and said replacement systems had been pulled from prearranged storage to keep the airspace secure. Even in a defensive public narrative, that is a quiet concession that the protective layer was hit hard enough that patchwork had to begin, and patched is not restored. Patched means the original structure failed badly enough that backup parts had to be dragged into service under pressure. Patched means every remaining radar and launcher is now living in a war where the other side already knows the seams. So yes, the title's first promise is substantially real. Iran's air defense architecture appears to have been degraded deeply enough to alter the geometry of the war. That is why the route to Tehran matters more than any one explosion ever could. But the second promise is trickier and more explosive. If 13,000 targets have already been hit, what exactly was hit? Missile launchers, radar sites, bunker mouths, industrial nodes, command facilities, assembly chains, repeat strikes on the same network, economic assets. A massive count can hide a lot of categories inside one intimidating number. And governments know that they love giant totals because totals flatten complexity. They turn a messy war into one clean feeling. We are winning. They are breaking. Keep going. Underneath all of that sits an uglier problem. Officials acknowledged in closed-door briefings that there was no intelligence suggesting Iran planned to attack U.S. forces first, which means one of the public urgency arguments behind this war was weaker than the scale of the campaign later made it sound. That matters because once the original rationale goes soft, the target count starts doing double duty. It is no longer just about destruction. It becomes retroactive proof, a way of saying the war must have been necessary because look at how much has now been hit. But that is not proof. That is narrative backfill. And it is exactly why serious viewers should stop staring at the biggest number and start staring at the most revealing one. That revealing number is not 13,000, it is 80. Because if 80% of the air defenses are truly gone or even close to it, then the state's strategic problem is not just loss, it is exposure. And exposure does not equal safety for the other side. Even under this pressure, around 40 Iranian missiles still evaded defenses and killed at least 20 people in Israel and the occupied West Bank. That is the cruelty of the surviving percentage. It does not need to dominate the war, only survive it well enough to keep puncturing the illusion of complete control. That is why the audience clicked, whether they realized it or not to hear that bombs fell, not to hear that numbers are big. They click to know whether Iran's shield has cracked enough to open a more dangerous phase, and whether enough still survives underneath that shield to make the next phase nastier, not cleaner. The answer is yes on both counts. And that combination is what turns this from a strike story into a war story. More than 50% of Iranian missiles are now described as carrying cluster munition warheads, which means interception itself can stop being a clean answer, even when the missile body is broken. The defender can still face scattered submunitions, wider danger zones, and a second wave of fear after the first impact should have been over. That is not just leftover fire, that is adaptation under pressure. If Iran cannot fully close the sky above itself, it can still make every surviving launch more chaotic, more expensive to defeat, and more politically useful when even partial leakage creates national shock. This is why the coalition keeps hunting the remains of the air defense network, not because the first 80% was meaningless, but because the last 20% protects the assets nobody wants to discuss openly yet. The final slice of a shield is usually wrapped around the most politically sensitive targets. Even while claiming more than 80% of Iran's air defense systems had been destroyed, the campaign was still striking an air defense site in Naushar and a long-range anti-aircraft missile assembly site in Almant, Ghazvan province, and that tells you the shield was not being treated as finished. It was still being hunted because what remained still mattered. And of course it mattered. The last surviving layer of air defense is the layer standing between an air campaign and full strategic suffocation. It protects the things the enemy wants next, not the things they were already comfortable hitting. Yesterday, that is when the target list starts drifting. It begins with radars and launchers, then it moves through assembly sites and missile infrastructure. After that, the war starts staring at the systems that keep the state economically upright. The moment Karg Island enters open strategic language, the war gets a new center of gravity. Karg handles the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports, so talking publicly about taking it means the conflict is drifting beyond military degradation and toward the economic throat of the state. That is what Open Skies buy. Not just more strikes, options. And in war, options are terrifying because they let power migrate from battlefield targets to survival targets. Once that migration begins, every refinery, export terminal, fuel corridor, and maritime choke point starts vibrating with the same question. If they can keep coming, what will they choose next? Iranian strikes are increasingly described as focusing on Gulf states' economic foundations and civilian infrastructure, not only military positions. That is Tehran's answer to losing altitude in the air war. If it cannot fully stop the coalition above Iran, it can still widen the pain map until the whole region feels the price in shipping, energy, and fear. So no, this title is not really about one side winning cleanly and the other side collapsing neatly. It is about one side opening the sky while the other side keeps enough buried pain to stop the region from breathing easily. And that is the truth the audience came for. Iran appears to have lost a huge amount of air defense integrity. The coalition appears to have hit Iran on a massive scale, but the combination does not produce closure. It produces a more dangerous kind of war, one where access is real, escalation is still alive, and the next phase can get uglier because the shield is weaker, not because the enemy is finished. If the official claims are broadly true, then Iran is now fighting from behind a badly damaged protective sky while its most sensitive targets grow more reachable by the week. If the official claims are inflated, the deeper conclusion still survives. Enough of that sky has been opened that the campaign can keep choosing tomorrow's battlefield faster than Iran can safely close it. That is the answer hidden inside the title. 13,000 targets is the scale of the pressure. 80% of Iran's air defense is gone is the reason that pressure keeps getting closer to the center. Because once a country stops trusting the air over the road to its own capital, every remaining target becomes a threat waiting to be scheduled. Stay with this channel, because the next move in a war like this is usually decided before the public even understands what the last move really meant.